I still remember the exact sound of my own crying, not sobbing, not wailing. Just that quiet, hollow sound, the kind that only comes out when you've stopped expecting anyone to hear you. I cried every single night for 2 years. Every night. And I want you to understand something. I am not a dramatic woman. I raised 3 children. I buried my mother. I kept going, but something happened to me at 58 years old that I was not prepared for. And the morning I stopped crying, the morning I finally stopped, was the morning I started becoming someone I didn't even know I was capable of being. My name is Loretta. I'm 62 years old. I live in a small house just outside of Morgantown, West Virginia, and if you drove past it, you probably wouldn't look twice. White siding. A porch with 2 chairs. A garden in the back that I started 2 years ago when I finally had enough quiet to put my hands in the ground. I want to tell you something true. Not polished, not a lesson wrapped up with a ribbon, just true, the kind of true that sits in you like a stone for a long time before it becomes something lighter. I was married for 31 years. 31 years to a man named Gerald. He was a good-looking man when I met him, tall, broad-shouldered, with this slow, easy laugh that made you feel like everything was going to be fine. I was 26 when we married. I had just finished 2 years of community college, was working as a bookkeeper for a small auto parts company, and I thought, the way young women think, the way we're trained to think, that finding a good man and building a life together was the thing. The main thing. The whole point of everything that came before. So I married Gerald, and I meant every word. We moved to Morgantown because Gerald had family there and work in the coal industry was steadier than anything else we knew how to reach for. We bought the house I still live in. We painted it together. We hung our wedding photo in the hallway. We had our daughter, Brenda, and then 8 years later, late and surprising and wonderful, we had our twins, Dale and Marcus. 3 children. I was a mother. I was a wife. I kept the books for a dental office for 22 years, part-time when the kids were small, then full-time once they hit middle school. I cooked dinner most nights. I went to every school play, every little league game, every parent-teacher conference. I sat with my mother through her last 3 years of life when her mind started going, driving 40 minutes each way to her assisted living facility, twice a week, every week. I buried her in 2012, and I cried hard for a week. And then I got back up because Gerald's father was sick and somebody needed to handle it. That was my life. I'm not complaining. I want to be very clear about that. I'm not telling you these things so you'll feel sorry for me. I loved my children with everything I had. I loved being a mother. I even loved the busyness of it, the way a full house feels like a kind of music. But I will tell you this. Somewhere along the way, I stopped being a person and became a function. I didn't notice it happening. That's the thing nobody warns you about. It doesn't feel like loss when it's happening. It just feels like life, like necessity. Like this is just who you are now. And by the time the kids were grown and out of the house, I had spent so many years being useful that I had almost completely forgotten what it felt like to simply be. Gerald and I were good at living together. I want to say that clearly because this story is complicated and I don't want to get ahead of myself. We were good at the daily rhythms. We knew each other's habits. We finished each other's sentences. We had a shorthand that took decades to develop. But I think, if I'm being honest, and I told you this was going to be honest, we had stopped really seeing each other somewhere around year 12 or 15. We were partners in the household. We were parents. We were, in the way that long-married couples often become, more like very familiar roommates than 2 people who were choosing each other every day. I accepted that. I told myself it was normal, that the passion part burns off and what's left is something deeper, more durable. I told myself that what Gerald and I had was real and solid, and that the movies were lying to everybody about what love is supposed to feel like in your 50s. I told myself a lot of things. In October of 2020, the world was still locked down and strange, and Gerald was working from home, and I was working from home, and we were together almost every hour of every day for the first time in our entire marriage. And instead of that closeness bringing us together, it showed me, with a terrible kind of clarity, how far apart we already were. We didn't fight. That wasn't the problem. We were polite, considerate even. We passed each other in the kitchen and asked how the other slept and whether they'd seen the remote. Control. We watched the same television shows every evening from opposite ends of the couch. We went to bed at the same time. But there was something underneath all of that that felt like a hum, like a noise in the walls that you can hear if the house is quiet enough. I told myself I was imagining it. Then came March of 2021. I had been cleaning the office where Gerald kept his computer and his papers, the small room off the hallway that had always been his space, which I respected and rarely entered. He was outside shoveling the walk after a late winter snow. I was just trying to dust the shelves, move some things around. I wasn't looking for anything. I want you to believe that because it's true. I have never been a suspicious wife. I had never read his texts or checked his email or done any of the things that the suspicious wives on the talk shows do. That was not who I was. But there was a piece of paper on his desk that had fallen half behind his monitor, and when I pushed the monitor slightly to dust underneath it, the paper slid fully onto the desk, face up. It was a phone number, written in Gerald's handwriting, nothing else. Just a name, a woman's first name, which I will not say here, and a number with a 304 area code. Right there in Morgantown. I stood there for a long moment. I put the paper back exactly where it had been. I went back to the kitchen. I filled a glass of water. I stood at the sink and drank it very slowly, looking out at Gerald in the yard, his back to me, the snow coming down soft around him. And I told myself it was nothing. A work contact. A friend's wife he'd written down to pass along to someone. There were 100 reasonable explanations, and I chose to pick one and put the paper down and not say a word. I went back to being a function. For 3 more months, I went back to being a function. But the hum in the walls was louder now. I started noticing the small things that I had previously trained myself not to notice. How he angled his phone away from me when it lit up. How he'd started taking longer drives on Saturday mornings, always with a vague reason. How sometimes, in the evenings, he'd get a look on his face, a distant, almost dreamy look, that had nothing to do with me or the house or anything in the room we were sitting in. I noticed, and I said nothing, and I hated myself for saying nothing. June came, hot and green, the way West Virginia summers are, that thick, gorgeous green that feels like the whole world is alive and breathing. And on a Tuesday evening, Gerald told me he was going to drive up to his brother Ray's place for a few days. Said Ray had some work on the property, needed an extra pair of hands. I didn't say anything except, "Okay, safe drive." I watched him pack his bag. I watched him load it in the truck. I stood in the front doorway and waved when he backed out. And then I went back inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and stayed there for a very long time. Something in me had already started to know. I think that's the part that's hardest to talk about, actually, not the discovery itself, but the months and months before it when I already knew, somewhere beneath my sternum, and I kept choosing not to know. Because knowing meant the end of something. Knowing meant I'd have to do something with what I knew. And I was 58 years old, and my whole identity for 30 years had been built around this man, and this house, and this life, and I was terrified. Terrified of what knowing would cost me. When Gerald came home 4 days later, he was lighter. That's the word I keep coming back to. He was lighter. He smiled more easily. He was more affectionate with me, more talkative over dinner, more interested in how my day had gone, and I understand now that what I was witnessing was the particular lightness of a person who has been somewhere they wanted to be. I watched him and I smiled back, and I passed the potatoes, and I did not say a word. The crying started that night. Not because I had proof, not because anything had changed, technically, in the facts of my life, but because something had shifted in me that couldn't be shifted back. I lay in the dark and Gerald slept next to me, and I cried as quietly as I possibly could. I pressed my face into the pillow and I cried, and I did it so carefully, so silently, that he never once stirred. I did that for 2 years. Not every night in the acute, desperate way of the first few months. It changed over time, became something different, sometimes softer and sometimes harder, but nearly every night, in some form, there was crying. Sometimes it was just tears sliding down into the pillow while I stared at the ceiling. Sometimes it was a few minutes in the bathroom with the fan running. Sometimes it was in my car in the parking lot of the grocery store before I allowed myself to go inside and act normal. I found out the real truth, the full truth, in November of that same year. I'm not going to go through all the details of how it happened, because that part isn't really the point. What I will tell you is that I had been carrying enough suspicion long enough that, when I finally decided to really look, I found what I was looking for in about 15 minutes. Her name, her picture, messages that went back more than 2 years. 2 years? So the night I cried for the first time in the parking lot wasn't even the beginning. It was just the moment my body caught up to what my gut had known even longer. I sat with my phone in my hands in our bedroom while Gerald was downstairs watching television. I could hear the sound of the TV floating up through the floor. I sat there reading things I cannot unread, and I thought very calmly, terrifyingly calmly, I have been living in a story that was not the one I thought I was in. He came upstairs an hour later and got ready for bed, and I had put the phone away, and I lay there very still while he settled in beside me. And then I said, "Who is she?" The silence that followed was the loudest silence I have ever experienced in my life. He didn't say anything for what felt like a very long time. I could hear his breathing change. "Loretta, I'm not asking you if, I'm asking you who." Another silence. "Her name is Diane. She lives over in Fairmont." "How long?" He told me. It was longer than 2 years. It was longer than I had found in the messages. I don't remember everything I said after that. I remember keeping my voice very low and very controlled, the way you do when you're so far past the point of shouting that shouting would feel almost beside the point. I remember him using the word mistake several times, and I remember feeling, with a clarity I had never experienced before, that the word was too small for what he was describing. A mistake is a wrong turn. A mistake is a forgotten appointment. What he had done was a sustained, deliberate choosing of something else over me, over and over again, for years. I told him he needed to leave, not for the night, not temporarily. He did not leave that night. He cried. He apologized. He told me it was over, had been over for a while, that he had been trying to find a way to tell me. I sat in the chair in the corner of our bedroom, and I listened to all of it, and I felt something in me that I can only describe as a terrible clarity. Like when you finally get the right prescription glasses and you realize you've been seeing a blurred version of everything for years. I told him we would talk more in the morning, because I needed the night to be over. He left the next day, packed more than one bag this time. I stood in the doorway again. I watched him back out of the driveway again. This time I did not wave. I went inside and I sat on the kitchen floor, not in a chair, on the actual floor with my back against the cabinet, and I cried in a way I had not cried since my mother died. Not the careful, quiet pillow crying. Loud crying. Ugly crying. The kind that racks your whole body and leaves you hollow and raw. I cried on that kitchen floor for a long time. And then I got up. I washed my face. I made a pot of coffee. I called my daughter, Brenda, and I told her in as clear and simple words as I could manage that her father and I were separating. She cried. I listened. I told her I was going to be okay. I did not know yet if that was true, but I said it because she needed to hear it, and because saying it out loud felt like the first brick of something. I called my friend Carla, who has been my closest friend since 1998. She drove over that same night with a bottle of wine and a pan of brownies, and she didn't ask me a lot of questions. She just sat with me on the couch, and we watched a bad movie, and she held my hand during the commercials. That was a Wednesday. By Friday, I was crying again every night. The difference now was that it was an honest grief. It wasn't the grief of a woman in denial, crying in a pillow so her husband wouldn't hear. It was an open grief, a real one, the grief of finally allowing yourself to feel the true size of what you had lost. And I had lost a lot. Not just Gerald, not just the marriage. I had lost the story I thought my life was. I had lost the woman I thought I had been, the devoted wife, the steady one, the one who kept everything running. Because if I looked at it honestly, that woman had made herself smaller and smaller for 30 years in service of a man who was, for at least 3 of those years, somewhere else. That is a hard thing to sit with. There were nights when the grief turned into something that frightened me a little, not dangerous, but dark. A kind of heaviness that made getting out of bed feel genuinely difficult. I would lie there in the morning, with the pale winter light coming through the curtains, and think about how I had to get up and do the whole day again, just me and the quiet house, and the thought was exhausting in a way I couldn't have prayed. I did. I am not ashamed of those nights. I just want you to know they existed, because if you have had them, if you are having them, I want you to know that they do not mean you are broken. They mean you are in the middle of something enormous, and the middle is always the hardest part. My son Marcus called me every Sunday without fail. He's 30 years old, works over in Charleston, sensible young man, not much for emotional conversations, but he would call me every Sunday morning without exception, and we would talk for an hour about anything, his work, my garden, what was on TV, what I'd been reading. He never pushed. He just kept calling. I cannot tell you how much that meant, the regularness of it, the dependability. In a season when I felt like the ground was moving under my feet, those Sunday calls were something to hold on to. Brenda was harder. Brenda has always been more like her father in temperament, quick to feel, quick to speak, not naturally given to stillness. She wanted to be angry on my behalf. She wanted to call Gerald and say things that I had specifically asked her not to say. She wanted me to cry more openly around her, which somehow made me want to cry less. We fumbled through that year. Her and I, we said some things that were too sharp, we apologized, we found our way back. We always do. She's my daughter, and I love her with everything in me. Dale, my other twin, he lives out in Oregon now, and the distance made him feel helpless, I think. He sent things, books he thought I'd like, a very good blanket, a card every few weeks with his handwriting in it. There is something about a handwritten card that a text message cannot replace, and I want to say that here because I don't know if Dale knows how much those cards meant to me. The divorce was finalized 11 months after Gerald moved out. I sat in a lawyer's office on a Tuesday in October and signed the papers and walked outside into a parking lot full of ordinary afternoon sun, and I stood next to my car for a few minutes and I thought, what now? I had no answer, not that day. The crying continued into the winter, and then into the following spring, and I began to understand that this was just going to be my private ritual for a while. The nightly release of everything I had held together during the daylight hours, the price of functioning, and I paid it. I paid it every night. What I did not do, and this matters, was disappear into it. I went to a counselor named Dr. Pauline Vargas, whom I found through a recommendation from my doctor. I want to talk about her for a minute, because I think women in their 50s sometimes believe that therapy is something young people do, or something you do when you're in crisis, not when you're just quietly grieving the wreckage of your own life. I sat in Pauline's office for the first time feeling almost embarrassed about why I was there. I said something like, I know this probably isn't even that serious compared to some things you hear. She looked at me very steadily and said, Loretta, you rebuilt your life around one person for 31 years. That person turned out to be living a different life than the one you thought you shared. You're allowed to call that serious. I went to Pauline every other week for a year and a half. I still go once a month. She did not fix me. That is not what therapy does, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. What she did was give me a space where I could hear my own thoughts said out loud without having to manage anyone else's reaction to them. That is more valuable than I can put into words. There was one session in particular. This was about 8 or 9 months after the separation, when I said something that shocked me in the saying of it. We were talking about the period before I found out, the months when I knew and didn't know, and Pauline asked me what I thought I had been afraid of back then. And I said, very quickly, without even thinking about it, I was afraid of finding out I had wasted my life. There was a silence. Then Pauline said, gently, "And do you believe that now, that you wasted your life?" I sat with that question for a long time. The answer, when it came, surprised me. No. Not because nothing was taken from me. It was. Years were taken from me, and choices, and a version of my future that I had assumed was real. Those are real losses. I'm not going to minimize them. But waste is the wrong word, because I had raised 3 good people. I had sat with my mother through her last years with love and patience. I had kept good faith with my own values, my own character, through 30 years of a life that was harder and quieter and lonelier than I had admitted to anyone. I had not wasted those years. I had lived them as well as I knew how with the information I had. That realization, that I had not wasted my life, only been deceived about certain parts of it, was the first time I can remember feeling something other than grief or numbness or the low-grade exhaustion of surviving. It felt almost like a small warm light coming on in a room that had been dark for a long time. It didn't solve everything, not that day, not for months after. But it was the beginning. The morning I stopped crying, the morning I told you about at the very start, that happened in late April of the 2nd year after Gerald left. I didn't plan it. I didn't have some cinematic moment of decision. I simply woke up one morning and realized I had fallen asleep without crying the night before. I lay there in the early light thinking about that. And then, instead of the usual pull toward sadness, I noticed something else. I was thinking about the backyard. I had been thinking, for months, about planting a garden. Not just a few tomatoes in pots the way I'd done for years, a real garden. A full quarter of the backyard. Raised beds, maybe, herbs and vegetables and some flowers along the border. I had been wanting to do it for years, and there had always been a reason not to. Gerald didn't see the point. It seemed like too much work on top of everything else. There was always something more urgent. That morning, lying in bed in the April light, I thought, there is nothing stopping me now. It wasn't a triumphant thought. It wasn't even a particularly joyful one. It was quiet, almost matter-of-fact. Just a woman lying in bed realizing that for the first time in her adult life, she didn't have to negotiate her own desires with anyone. I got up, I made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window looking at the backyard. And I started planning. I called a garden center. I went online and read more articles about raised bed construction than any reasonable person would read. I bought lumber. I borrowed Carla's husband's drill. I spent 3 weekends building 4 raised beds in the backyard, and those weekends were some of the most satisfying I can remember in years. Physical work, the kind that leaves your hands tired and your mind clear, the kind that produces something you can see and stand next to. I planted in May. Tomatoes, green beans, zucchini, 2 kinds of basil, a row of sunflowers along the back fence, and an entire bed of lavender that Carla said I was being overly ambitious about and that I considered a personal challenge. The lavender thrived. That fall, I filled mason jars with tomatoes I'd canned myself and lined them on the kitchen shelf. And I stood there and looked at them and felt something I want to describe carefully. Because it's easy to overstate this kind of feeling, and I promised you I wasn't going to overdramatize. I felt like myself. Not a new self, not a transformed, reborn, better than ever self, just myself. The self that had always been there underneath all the years of being someone's wife and someone's mother and someone's bookkeeper. The woman who liked to make things and grow things and have a project and finish it. The woman who had opinions about how she wanted her days to go. The woman who actually, when given the space to find out, turned out to have more resilience and more resourcefulness than she had ever been required to show. That woman had been in there the whole time. She just hadn't had much room. I took a watercolor class that winter through the community center. I had always been curious about painting and had always told myself I wasn't artistic, which turned out to be something I had absorbed from somewhere. A teacher, maybe, or just the general cultural message that artistic people are a special category and you either are or you aren't. Pauline had pointed out with characteristic gentleness that I had never actually tried, so I had no real evidence either way. She was right, I was not particularly talented. My watercolors were earnest and imprecise, and I loved making them. I kept every single one. I want to say something about loneliness here, because I think it's important to be honest about it. My life is quieter now than it has ever been. Some evenings I sit on the porch in the two chairs, just the two chairs, one of which nobody sits in, and the quiet is so complete that I can hear the field out back, the insects and the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower and the particular hush of a West Virginia evening in the summer, and I feel it. The absence. I would be lying if I told you the loneliness was gone. But there is a difference, and I am still working out exactly how to describe this difference, between the loneliness I felt during the marriage and the loneliness I feel now. The loneliness I felt during the marriage was the worst kind, I think. It was the loneliness of a person surrounded by the appearance of company, of a woman sleeping next to someone who was somewhere else, emotionally and sometimes literally. A loneliness that you can't even name, because everyone looking at you from the outside sees a marriage, a family, a full life. This loneliness is cleaner. It is a real and a see-knowledged thing. I know what it is. I can sit with it on the porch in the two chairs and look at it directly and say, yes, I am alone this evening, and I wish things had been different, and also, the garden looks good, and the lavender came back this spring, and Brenda is coming for a visit next weekend, and Marcus called this morning, and made me laugh so hard I spilled my coffee. Both things are true at the same time, the loss and the life, the grief and the gardening, the emptiness in one chair and the fullness in the other parts of the day. I think that is, in the end, what I have learned. Not some grand lesson about forgiveness or fate or everything happening for a reason. I don't have patience anymore for the tidy versions of other people's pain. What I have learned is this. You can survive things you were certain you could not survive. Not by being strong in the way people mean when they tell you that you're strong, as though strength is something you simply have or don't have, a fixed quality, a kind of armor. You survive by being present for the next small thing. The cup of coffee. The Sunday phone call. The garden bed that needs building. You survive by staying in the game of your own life even when the game feels pointless and exhausting and like a game designed specifically to defeat you. You survive, sometimes, by crying in your car in the parking lot of a grocery store, and then walking inside and buying the things on your list. You survive by telling the truth to yourself, to the people you trust, to a counselor in a small office who listens without judgment and asks the questions that take you to the answers you already have. You survive, eventually, by noticing one April morning that you didn't cry the night before, and instead of being suspicious of that, instead of waiting for the sadness to return, you let yourself lie there in the light and think about what you want to plant this year. I am 62 years old. I live alone. I have a garden and 3 children and a best friend who brings brownies and a watercolor class I go to on Thursday evenings and a counselor I still see once a month. I have 2 chairs on the porch, one of which nobody sits in. I have a life that is entirely, for the first time, my own. And I will tell you something, leaning in close, as honestly as I know how. It is not the life I planned, but it is not a small life either. If you are in the middle of something hard, if you are in that season of crying and surviving and keeping it together just enough to function, I want you to know that I see you. I know how long 2 years can feel. I know how heavy a secret grief becomes when you carry it alone for months and months. I know what it costs to smile at the grocery store and at dinner and at the office when something inside you is breaking. I am not going to tell you it gets better in a week or a month, or that there is a specific moment when the sun comes out and everything is resolved. That is not how it works. Not in real life anyway. In real life, it gets better slowly and unevenly, with setbacks and bad nights and good days that you're almost afraid to trust. But it does get better. And here is the part I really need you to hear. The part I wish someone had said to me when I was in the very worst of it. You are not waiting to become someone on the other side of this. You already are hurt. She has been there the whole time, in the way you kept going, in the way you protected your kids, in the way you got up every morning and made the coffee and did the next thing. She has been there in the quiet and the crying and the clenched jaw and the car park tears. She has been there, patient and waiting, for you to clear enough space to meet her. The morning I stopped crying was not the morning I became myself. It was the morning I finally recognized who I had always been. That is the only thing I know for cert. That is the only thing I have to give you. If any of this felt true to your life, if you recognized yourself anywhere in this story, leave a comment and tell me. I read everyone. I may not know you, but I am not a stranger to what you're carrying. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, a mother, a sister, a friend who is in the middle of something she can't talk about out loud yet, share this with her. Sometimes we send the thing we can't say ourselves. Take care of yourself. I'll be here.